Hello, so I wanted to make a different video, uh, away from the usual reviews and the other fun topics that I usually cover. And instead I wanted to focus on something that happened today, which, for a little bit of context in the future, today is the 27th of April, and today President Joe Biden gave a brief press conference regarding the updated mandates, well, not mandates, but guidelines on face mask use. And the reason is that the goal has been met. So over 2 million vaccinations have been given, and hospitalizations among seniors have decreased below 70%. And regarding the vaccination inequality, has also been reduced to the extent that now there is a greater percentage of Latino and African American seniors who are vaccinated compared to their white counterparts. Now, President Biden also made, he announced the updated guideline saying that for people who have been fully vaccinated, so that means if you got the first dose but are still missing the second, you are only partially vaccinated, so it doesn't really apply to you, not yet. Especially with the amount of people who have reported getting the first vaccination but never got the second because of reasons. It could be because they didn't want to get the vaccination, or maybe they are scheduled until later on. It's just their first vaccination they've got. Now, part of the guidelines is if for people who are fully vaccinated, again, they may not use the face mask when they're outdoors under the condition that is not a crowded area. So let's say if you're in a venue, or for example Universal Studios, or if you're in a park where there's an event, or you're in a highly urban area like New York and there's a lot of foot traffic, then of course you need to use the face mask. But if you're fully vaccinated, so you got every dose, you are outdoors and you're not surrounded by people, then you don't need to use the face mask. Now, this can be interpreted by a few ways. And if we look back to 1 year ago, where the incidents, the new cases, and the hospitalization rates were increasing, especially once it hit the summer, they increased even more and it was getting out of control. Well, it's very tempting for many people to say, hey, we no longer need to use face masks. That's what President Biden said. That's what the CDC says. Of course, people who never minded the guidelines in the first place, it doesn't really matter because they haven't been wearing a face mask or they've been refusing to wear one. However, it is very dangerous to think that there's no longer anything to be worried about, no longer to be concerned, because this will only, well, this will lower people's defenses, right? In the sense that you are putting yourself at risk if you think that this is the end of the story and that you can just disregard any precautions. What do I mean by all of this? So people who think that this is good news, and it actually is, but who think that this is a mark that, okay, you no longer have to use face mask at all. You no longer need to be careful. You can do whatever you want. Not exactly. Because businesses are private property, they can make their own rules. So even with President Biden saying that for people fully vaccinated, no face masks no longer needed outdoors and etc., people might take that as a liberty to not use face mask at all. And if a business asks you to wear a face mask while you're conducting business or while you're on the property, you still have to pay attention. You still have to follow those policies, even if it's not like a constitutional law or, crazy things that people like to say. Now, if we look at the history of um, face mask, and not just face masks, but antiseptic procedures, washing hands, wearing gloves, you will get to understand a little bit more about the importance of not disregarding face masks completely, and why it's more important than ever to change our models, our own belief systems regarding these safety measures, these health measures. So I'm just going to go a little bit back in time. And these are times of the 1800s with Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and the Dr. Robert Lister. Now, during those times, microbes, microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, all this, they were considered germs. Now, today we still use that as a colloquialism, but back then they didn't really understand where they came from. And so, to put it simply, Louis Pasteur, and this was the time of the cholera and the chickenpox and all of this. Louis Pasteur, he made some cultures. Now, during this time, microscopes and microbiologists weren't that much of a thing. And even then, microbiologists were more than anything people who were interested in microscopy and were using microscopes, which were first designed by Leeuwenhoek. Now, Louis Pasteur, when he was examining these microorganisms, he grew a culture, and in one occasion, he had left him, and they got old, and they weren't in a protective environment to grow and grow and grow, but they were still there. And he found that these cultures of bacteria, they lost their potency. They were no longer as dangerous. And if he were to administer these bacteria into the chickens, they were actually protected from getting the disease. And so, in there was this one family, and the child had been bitten by a rabies infected animal. This booster had been isolating the virus that causes rabies, which actually, just as a self correction, is not a virus, it's a prion. It's a little bit different. And what he was able to do basically was he injected the kid with this, and the kid, he didn't get rabies, he didn't die, he was protected. And so this gives rise to not the birth necessarily, because there have been events that happened prior, such as with Edward Jenner, and then before that with Lady Mary Montagu. Well, this is how you begin to see the rise in vaccines. Now, during this time, Robert Koch had also been working with the Mycobacterium, which is a bacteria that causes tuberculosis, or TB, how people know it. And as they've been examining these microorganisms, they begin to discover that there's some that the possible way that they infect others is through air. They still haven't caught the concept of how, but they knew that the air was an influence somehow, which I'll cover in just a bit. Robert Lister, or Dr. Robert Lister, he was a surgeon in, I want to say, was maybe Germany, or he was a German who, he was a doctor who, he was a surgeon. Now, when he was in the hospital, he noticed that many patients died not because of the surgery, but there was a reason why patients were dying, and he wanted to know why. And as much as they cleaned the wounds after the surgery and everything, they were still dying. And the question was why. Now, Dr. Lister, he never agreed with the concept of bad air with miasma. However, he did think about, well, what could be causing during the process that maybe it's during the surgery that a patient gets infected, and it gets worse after they recuperate from the surgery itself. Now, he does come across some of the works by Louis Pasteur, and he does do some changes such as using gloves, changes such as washing his hands, and not just him, but his assistants as well, everybody who's going to be involved in surgery, washing their hands with carbolic acid. And not just that, but once you're doing the surgery, clean the area and then clean it once you're finished. And so he developed the system, this antiseptic system, which was not used prior in that time. And so they did see a decrease. And at first, many surgeons, even from America and every other place, they didn't take him seriously. But after a while, it did catch on. And so now, part of the procedures today is the doctors have to wash their hands, uh, ideally, right? You can't guarantee that they do this all the time, but whoever's going to be in the surgery washes their hands first, then they clean their hands in a more antiseptic method using polyiodine, which is an iodized solution, but it's a little bit different. And when they're scrubbing their hands and their nails, and it has its particular method, but in essence, they create this foam, and with this foam, they start brushing off, and then they rinse it with the water, rinsing the water from above towards the bottom, so that whatever is rinsing down doesn't contaminate what is already clean. And so the primary thinking is, well, yes, it's an antiseptic, but also with the foam, it's more of a mechanical way of cleaning, because the foam physically will brush away the bacteria and the microorganisms that might cause infection. And all of this is to kind of demonstrate that although methods such as wearing gloves, washing your hands, wearing face mask, which is now a little bit more prevalent in the operating room, well, they weren't. They were, well, before they were kind of a reason to for discussion, right? Not everybody was agreeing with these methods, and so it's not surprising that in a society such as ours in the United States, where there's so much personal freedoms and liberties and constitution and blah blah blah, all of these talking points that really have nothing to do with health. And it's not that I'm minimizing you know liberties and all that. It's just that when it comes to health, it's not health doesn't bacteria don't care about your constitutional rights. They don't care about your political ideology. For a virus, a bacteria, a fungi, any of these, if they find a host that they can start growing from, then there is that. And you get sick from either the toxins they create, or because they start invading other systems, or they begin taking nutrients. So when it comes to health, it is not about politics. It's about taking care of your health, but it's also about taking care of other people's health. Why? In times of tuberculosis, of cholera, which are now, I hesitate to say because I would have to double check to use the term eradicated from the US, but um, certainly the numbers are much, much, much lower compared to how they were back in the 1800s or before. Why? Well, now there's more sanitation. People are no longer, well, maybe some drunk people, but in general, people are not doing their business out in the streets. People are not getting in contact with contaminated water. People are not, uh, people are washing their hands. And so if somebody who is cooking your meal, as in a restaurant or fast food place or anywhere else, It's not that they use the restroom and then they're just giving you your food, so whatever came out or whatever they clean themselves is now in the food, which how you would get some form of food contamination. So, these health practices that have been going on, as you can see, they've been slowly catching on, but as people and have been finding that these procedures, these methods of hygiene have been working, they've been more prevalent in our society. And so if we go back to where we started with COVID-19 and everything, one of the things that we find is that American culture, the American society was not ready for the use of face masks, for washing hands in a more deliberate way. It it was just what many perceived as an invasion of privacy, which shouldn't be, right? Just as a quick story, there was one time which I was in Costco, and I'm one of those people that even if I'm going to urinate and use a urinal, I'm still going to wash my hands because I have to do the unzipper, and then if there's other things I've been touching, either to get in the restroom. Fortunately, Costco doesn't have doors you have to open to get in the restroom, but you get the idea. You've been touching many things, and then you're using the bathroom and all of this. So even if it's just urinating, I still wash my hands. Well, this one time I was in Costco, and I urinated and I did my thing. When I went over to wash my hands, there was this kid who I would say a few seconds behind me. He had also came in the restroom, did his thing, um, in one of the stalls next to me, and he had also urinated. Just to be clear, he he went to the faucet and he just put water in his hands, dried them, and that was that. But he did stop. He didn't immediately leave because I had grabbed soap. I was washing my hands very carefully. And it's not that I'm a neurotic, but I was just washing my hands like I usually do. I grabbed soap and I was spraying it, lathering my hands, and then rinsing it up with water, and that's it. Not more than a minute. I mean, a minute would be too much, but you get the idea. And he just stared as if he never knew someone who would, after using the urinal, wash their hands. Okay, what does this say? This says that it is ingrained from very little how you should carry on your hygiene practices and your responsibility in general. Because imagine this. Yes, he might have, wet his hands and rinsed it, whatever. But he didn't clean his hands. So if he starts touching everywhere else, let's say the clothes that are in Costco or the products or boxes or the refrigerators, where you have to grab the handle to open, just to mention a few places, or even the food, the food that's in the I don't want to say the freezer section, the other section where there's the meats and then the bread and all that. If he starts touching even the packaging, imagine what he touched prior, either in the bathroom, out of the bathroom, even after leaving the bathroom, all that's in his hands. So think about next time. You're out and about, you're in a store. Who touched that product or that food before you got there? And what is on that wrapping or that cover or that bag or that box, whatever is covering the food? Think about that. And I mentioned this not to be disgusting, but it's just to give you an idea and a sense of what we don't think about. There's two writers that I found, and in one case, we had her name is Cynthia Kim Beglin, and she writes in on this website on this quick little article about how when she used to live in Asia, uh, for a time she lived in China and Japan, and During that time, she noticed that many Asians were wearing face masks, and that the reason was, when she asked, was that it was polite to wear a face mask if you're feeling sick or if you have flu-like symptoms, coughing or runny nose, that sort of thing. It's a polite thing to do for other people. And also, if you're coughing, then it's going to stick more in the face mask than out and about. How many people haven't we seen that when they sneeze, they don't cover themselves, and then you can kind of picture particles everywhere. So, you know, we go back to this point, and why was it more prevalent to wear in Asia? Well, it wasn't precisely because of the COVID-19. But again, I'm talking about I think she was there in the early 2000s in Asia, where yes, they had a SARS outbreak, but it wasn't the COVID-19. It was a different type of SARS. Not just that, but they also used face masks because of the air pollution. And that's not something that we think about. I mean, how many people wouldn't benefit from using a face mask? I know I would, when the air started getting too polluted. And I'm not living in a city, I'm living in this rural area where, of course, it's a city, but it's a very small city. But anyway, how many particles are big enough to be caught on the outside of the mask? And not just that, because if you think about it, face masks do have some sort of covering, coating, I should say. And so, how much does that not benefit in the cases of air pollution? It would, right? But, I would venture to say no one here in the United States wears a face mask to protect themselves from pollution. They might wear sunglasses for the sun, or a hat, or some headwear for the sun as well. Some might wear sunblock, but no one would wear a face mask for pollution. Just something to think about. But to continue on with her story, even when she was living there and that it was very commonplace, she felt awkward. She didn't wear a face mask. She didn't want to wear a face mask. Not because it wasn't comfortable, because as she says, it's not comfortable, but because she felt weird. She felt strange. Even her husband, who wouldn't use a face mask, even if it was to leave the car on days that were too polluted, he would still refuse to wear a face mask. And now that they're back here in the US, and with the whole COVID-19, they've gotten used to wearing a face mask. And she reflects, saying that in Asia, they started using it because of the air pollution, because it is kind of a duty to protect others in society. It's good manners to be considerate if you're feeling sick. Now that she has to wear a face mask, she wonders why she hadn't used it before. Now that she's used to it, now that she has to use a face mask, right? The other writer, Ralph Jennings, he notes that for many decades, people have been wearing face masks, and it wasn't too prevalent before, but ever since the SARS pandemic back in the early 2000s, they've learned to wear face masks. They've learned to use them and to live with them, to the point now that, before the COVID-19, even if they're not feeling sick, but if they want just to be left alone, they will wear a face mask. And it's not that it's against their liberties or against their rights. It's just being considerate. It's just being kind to the person next to them if they know that they're going to be sick. Think about it. Before the COVID-19, if somebody was sneezing or coughing, what was your first reaction? You would turn away, right? To not get their particles. So why is wearing a face mask such a big deal? I don't know. Now, there, people will, like I mentioned before, people will use this announcement of the guidelines as an excuse. Whoever wasn't wearing a face mask before will continue to not wear one. Even with this pandemic seeming to simmer down, it is important to remember something, and to remember this: face masks are useful, and they've been used for a long time. But now we have to remember that this is a change that we should do. It's a collective change that should be done in regards to public health, not just for COVID-19, but we should start wearing face masks anytime that we're sick, anytime that there's a possibility of an upper respiratory infection. So, such as the influenza, such as, I know I said that's not very prevalent here in the US, but tuberculosis or pneumonia or, anything that might be an infection of your airways, coming from your airways. It has been proven before, decades and decades ago, that water droplets from our breathing, fluid droplets, as they're called, these are a mode of transmission for certain microorganisms that will embed themselves in your lungs, in your throat, in your nose. When they come expelled, they'll travel, and wherever they fall, they'll wait for the next host, you could say. Well, if we use a face mask, where are the droplets going? The water droplets, they might be big, but they're not big enough to go through the mask. And the microorganisms of the droplets are not going to be going through the face mask either if they're on the droplets. It's like putting a fence, right? If you're small enough to fit through a fence, not like a chain link fence, but if you have like a fence in which between each of the poles, it's, let's say, 3 feet, and you can fit through there, right? But if you're in a car, the car is not going to fit through that fence, and therefore, because you're in the car, you're not going to fit through it either. Same thing with these microorganisms. Since they're on the water droplets, if the water droplets don't make it through the mask, these microorganisms are not going to make it through either. Does that mean that it's 100% prevention for other people? Not necessarily. Because depending on how you're wearing your face mask, if it doesn't have a good seal, you're not wearing it properly, it's below your nose, that type of thing, obviously it's not going to be 100%, right? And it lowers its efficacy. There was a study where they analyzed the infection rate, or how well it prevented an infection, in households where a child has influenza and the members use face masks. It was found that the family members that used a face mask when there was a child with influenza did help. And even having the child wear the face mask also helped to prevent the spread. However, less than 40% of the participants actually used a face mask. And all this was self-reported, right? But it was concluded that using a face mask indoors, in your own home, when somebody was sick, wasn't always effective, not because of the face mask, but because of the person not wearing the face mask or not complying with wearing a face mask, regardless if it was a healthy family member or the sick person. And so this comes about into what is called the health belief model. And in the health belief model, I mean, you find there are different uh, there are different uh, beliefs, right? In the health model, in the health belief model, what it talks about, what it's the health belief model, what it addresses is that yes, there's going to be certain variables, certain factors, right? Gender, age, socioeconomic status, if you're an anxious person, if you don't deal with being told what to do, that type of thing. There are 5, you could say, factors. One is the perceived susceptibility. So how much do you perceive that you're likely to get sick with a disease, a certain disease? Perceived severity. So how sick you're going to become, how much you perceive that, how sick you perceive yourself you're going to get if you get sick. The health motivation. So what motivates you to stay healthy and prevent from getting a disease? Perceived benefits. You know, what do you perceive yourself as getting out from, you know, the health measures? And perceived barriers. So what do you perceive as going to be a hindrance to you engaging in the health behaviors? And that's going to lead to either you acting or not acting, but how you're going to confront these situations, so such as mask wearing, washing your hands constantly. And unfortunately, many people don't believe that they'll ever get sick with COVID-19, but also that because they're not old, because they're not young, that they're not going to get as sick. Like, who cares, right? I mean, anybody can do what they want. And that's not really the case. I mean, imagine if you yourself are a healthy individual, you can now get people sick, even if you're not sick yourself. I should probably switch that. Let's say if you get infected with the virus. I don't care if it's a COVID-19 or any, name the virus that you want. You have that virus. Even if you're not sick, you can still spread that virus. So imagine you're spreading it to your family, your mother, your father, your brothers, your sisters, your grandparents, your loved ones, your co-workers. Don't you think that is irresponsible? Don't answer that. Because if you're already disagreeing with me from the beginning of the video, then chances are you're not going to answer favorably to what I'm saying at this point. But mask wearing really does come down to, being conscious that it prevents from spreading a disease, from transmitting it. But that requires the person to be socially conscious, not just of themselves or that, oh, my family is fine, but how are you going to affect other people? It also requires that there be somebody to kind of inspire you to do that. So irregardless who spreads the message of you need to wear a face mask if you're sick, I mean, if you don't trust that person, or it means nothing to you, then of course you're not going to listen to what they're saying. There was a study back in 2006, 2007, where they found that Australians, they do listen to their doctors. The doctors would say, wear your face mask, and they would. Or if they have any other recommendations, they listened because they do respect and consider what their doctors are saying. You can see that there's a difference from how it works here in the US, right? But lastly, the point is that this is also something, not just mask wearing and not just washing your hands. These are behaviors that should be ingrained, that should be taught from a very young age, at home, at school. Why? Let's go again with the boy who didn't wash his hands. He just wet his hands. He had to learn that somewhere. most likely he learned that from watching his father. If he had brothers, and probably also watching his brothers do the same. Watching other kids, other boys doing that in school. So if they're learning these habits, these bad habits, then you can't be too surprised how people are reacting to the pandemic and to the guidelines and oh, it's against my civil, personal, yada yada, you know. So where do we start? We start with teaching proper hygiene and not just teaching that you do this because just because, but explain no, you wash your hands, do not get yourself sick when you put something in your mouth, but also because if your hands are dirty and you touch something that somebody else is going to grab later on, they themselves can get sick. So in that case, you know, it is partially your responsibility as well. Your civic duty to not endanger the health of other people. I'm not saying to be 100% responsible for the other person next to you not getting sick, but doing your part in not spreading diseases that should be prevented. I've said it from the first video that I posted, you know, where I was a little bit skeptical about, yes, you know, this thing might get worse because people are not going to take the care that they need to take. And it is true. I mean, if you look at how far we've gone up and down, then down, 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 and then a little bit up and then back down. Why? We are just not used as the American society, the American population here in America. We're not used to these proper health guidelines, this health care, caring for ourselves to protect others. We should not forget the use of face masks now that we're simmering out of the pandemic. We should reinforce the idea of wearing face masks. Why? Because COVID-19 is not the only virus to be spread through the water droplets in our breathing, through the fluid droplets. There are other diseases and other diseases that are to come in the future. Diseases that we might not be able to predict right now, but we do know that the respiratory infections do exist and that more will exist in the future, more variants. So we should begin reinforcing these health habits while it's still fresh on our minds. You know, while the effects from this quarantine and from this pandemic are still fresh, they're still fresh. Some of it is still ongoing, but while this is still fresh in our minds, we should reinforce the idea of if you're feeling sick, wear a face mask. Wash your hands as appropriate. You know, and I'm not going to say that wash your hands until they're raw and bleeding, but do your part. Be considerate of other people. This is all that I'm going to say about the matter, at least for now. But just remember, just because the guidelines have changed, it doesn't mean that we are safe, that we're out of the woods, as the expression goes. All right? And I do understand. You know, it's nice to hear some good news. This relaxation, it's an indicator of a good progress. But we do need to keep in mind that things can get worse. We're not out of the we're not out of this situation. It's getting better, but we're still not out. So, as a reminder, if you haven't gotten your vaccine, now it's time to get it. If you haven't finished, meaning that you did get the first dose, but you still need the second, get the second dose. People will say, oh, the, you know, people will say, oh, about their side effects from the second injection, from the second dose. Here's the thing, not everybody reacts the same way. And the cases that we've heard so far are not representative of how the majority of the people react. I had my first dose, what was it, a week or two ago? And it was fine. My first dose went fine. Maybe the second dose I'll have a side effect, but it doesn't matter because what's important is the immune system that it gets up to date, which on this COVID that's going around. So get vaccinated if you can, and now is the time. Wear a face mask if you feel sick. Even after this whole pandemic, once everything is all right, no pandemic, it's fine. Well, still wear a face mask if you're sick. Don't get other people infected. That's rude. Not just rude, it's irresponsible. It's not very American. And it's not just about the COVID-19. Again, if there's a vaccine that you need, get the vaccine. Don't be so hesitant. Right now I'm just rambling, but that is what I have to say on the matter. Stay vigilant, celebrate, but keep in mind, we're still not out of pandemic. So if you're going to be out and about where there's a lot of people, wear a face mask. If you're running and it's in a park and there's not that many people, sure, but have your face mask with you so that when you're in that area where there's a lot of people, just put it back on. Just wear it until you get to your car or you get inside your home. Face masks are not that terrible. You're not going to die from it. It's not taking away your oxygen. It's a ridiculous frame, I think, and it's a ridiculous thing to say, but it has to be said. Alright? I'll leave you with that thought. If anybody does listen to this, well, hope you're being safe. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.